Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the McGowan Theater, located in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Swanson, Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum and producer for the Noontime Lecture Series. Before we bring today's author on stage, I'd like to remind you of a few other programs that will be taking place in this theater in the near future. On Thursday, May 7th at 7 p.m., Dr. Jonathan Sarna will be here to discuss the story of the extraordinary relationship between Abraham Lincoln and the Jewish community with journalist Steve Roberts. Dr. Sarna will then be available to sign copies of his book, Lincoln and the Jews, A History, following the program. On Tuesday, May 12th at 7 p.m., Pulitzer Prize-winning and best-selling author Joseph Ellis will be on hand to discuss and sign copies of his new book, The Quartet, Orchestrating the Second American Revolution. And finally, on Thursday, May 28th at 7 p.m., Akil Reed Amar and Harold Holzer will be joined by Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas as they discuss Amar's new book, The Law of the Land, A Grand Tour of Our Constitutional Republic and Lincoln's Constitutional Vision. To find out more about these programs and all of our exhibits, please take one of our monthly event calendars, which you'll find in the racks in the theater lobby, or you can visit our website at www.archives.gov/calendar. Our topic for today is 88 Days to Kandahar, a CIA diary by Robert Grenier. A highly decorated 27-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency's clandestine service and a renowned... Whoops. Sorry, someone's got a cell phone going. That's okay. Sorry. A highly decorated 27-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency's clandestine service and a renowned expert on the Middle East, South Asia, and counterterrorism, Robert Grenier played a central leadership role in the greatest national security challenges of this generation. When 9/11 struck, he was the CIA's chief of station for Pakistan and Afghanistan, based in Islamabad. After preparing the original war plan for the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, approved by President George W. Bush on September 24th of 2001, Mr. Grenier went on to organize and direct the joint CIA Special Forces Afghan combat teams, which drove the Taliban and al-Qaeda from southern Afghanistan, effectively ending the initial military campaign. Later, as the U.S. prepared to invade Iraq, Mr. Grenier was brought back to Washington and named CIA Iraq Mission Manager, responsible for all CIA intelligence operations and analysis in that country and representing CIA in all White House policy deliberations on Iraq for a 2.5-year period. In 2006, he resigned from the CIA and went into retirement. Since then, while pursuing a business career, Mr. Grenier has appeared widely in both U.S. and international media, including many appearances on all the major TV networks, as well as CNN, PBS, History Channel, NPR, BBC, and many others. He's also been interviewed in literally dozens of leading print publications around the world. Mr. Grenier received an A.B. in philosophy from Dartmouth College and later did graduate studies in foreign affairs at the University of Virginia. He's chairman of ERG Partners, an investment banking ERG Partners, an investment banking providing financial advisory services, and serves on several boards, including the CIA Officers Memorial Foundation. He is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Please join me in welcoming Robert Grenier to the National Archives.
Well, thank you, Doug, for that introduction, and thank all of you for coming out today on such an absolutely gorgeous day. We're afraid that some of you might all abscond and decide to spend your time out in the mall, but I'm very glad that you came in to spend a few minutes with us here this afternoon. You know, 88 Days to Kandahar, my book, is in some ways, I guess, a sort of typical Washington book. I mean, it deals with foreign policy, counterterrorism, and like most authors in this genre, I guess I like to think that it's a fairly important book and that you can draw certain important lessons from it. But really, what I tried to do essentially in this book was just to tell a story. And our story begins early on a Sunday morning. It was a warm fall day in Islamabad, Pakistan. I was sound asleep in my bedroom, locked behind bolted steel doors. I'd been working until about 3 o'clock in the morning. I'd been sleeping fitfully for maybe 3 or 4 hours only. And suddenly the phone rang. Woke me up out of a dead sleep. And so I probably betrayed a little bit of annoyance when I picked up the phone and I said, "Hello?" And of course I immediately regretted it, because at the other end of the line there was a pause, and then a very familiar voice said, "Did I wake you up, son?" Oh, good God. It's the director. So I sat up at attention in my bed, and I did what you actually should do in those circumstances. I lied. I said, "No, Mr. Director, I was just getting up." Remember, this is early Sunday morning, my time out in Pakistan. It's late Saturday night here in Washington. And the director said, "Look, we're going to be meeting at Camp David tomorrow morning to talk about our war plan for Afghanistan." He said, "The Pentagon is telling us that there are very few military targets in all of Afghanistan. We can probably hit them all in just a matter of days. We know where all the terrorist training camps are, but they're all empty. The terrorists have all run away." And he literally asked me, he said, "Well, should we bomb empty camps?" Now think about this for a minute. This is the 23rd of September, 2001, 12 days after 9/11, the worst one-day disaster in American history since Pearl Harbor. And here's George Tenet, the Director of Central Intelligence, at the heart of power here in Washington, D.C., who's calling halfway around the world to some field operative to say, in essence, what do we do? If you didn't know we were in trouble before, you knew it now. So I really wasn't expecting this call, and I said, "Well, look, Mr. Director, I'm not sure we're thinking about this in just the right way. Now, you're asking me about military tactics. Actually, what we're dealing with here is a political problem. Now, yeah, it's probably not going to be all that hard for us to chase bin Laden and al-Qaeda." We didn't really refer to them as al-Qaeda in those days. We talked about them as being the Afghan Arabs, which is what the Afghans themselves called them. I said, "Look, we can probably chase bin Laden and his Arabs out of Afghanistan, but unless we're going to colonize the place, the problem is to keep them from coming back, to keep Afghanistan from again becoming a terrorist safe haven. Only Afghans can do that at the end of the day. So whatever military tactics we use, we need to make sure that they are sequenced and they're calibrated in such a way that we can bring about some new political dispensation in Afghanistan that will not only chase out bin Laden and the Arabs, but will keep them out and keep the country from, again, becoming a terrorist safe haven." So I started to walk him through it, and he kept interrupting me to ask questions and pausing to take notes. I said, "Look, Mr. Director, this isn't going to work. This is taking too much time. Let me try to write all this down." So he said, "Okay, good idea." It was after 11 o'clock his time. He said, "Look, the helicopter comes for me to take me to Camp David, 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. I'm going to be up at 5. Can you get me something by then?" So I said, "Yes, sir, I can." So I raced into my office, and in about 3 hours, I banged out an 8-page cable. By this time, my senior lieutenants had come into the office on this Sunday morning, and I circulated it to all of them, got some very good suggestions from them, incorporated those suggestions, sent it off to Mr. Tenet's security detail with instructions that they should hand it to him as soon as he got up. And as far as I knew, that was the end of the story. I sent this thing off, and I didn't know what happened after that. But when he awakened, his security people handed it to him. He looked it over. He immediately sent copies to the other members of the War Cabinet, to Vice President Cheney and Condoleezza Rice and Secretaries Powell and Rumsfeld and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And they discussed it that Sunday at Camp David. And the following day, they met with the president in the Situation Room at the White House, and the president said, "Done. This is our template going forward." And the first I knew was later on that Monday afternoon when I was asked to do a secure video teleconference with General Tommy Franks, commander of Central Command, who was going to be responsible for the military campaign in Afghanistan, to make sure that his battle plan conformed with what we had agreed we should do going forward. It's a highly unusual circumstance. CIA doesn't normally get asked to write battle plans. We're supposed to inform policy, not to make policy. But it was a highly unusual circumstance, and I was in a position where I was one of the few people in the U.S. government, frankly, who knew anything about Afghanistan. It wasn't because of any particular wisdom on my part. So what was it that we said in this 8-page message that was approved by the president? And by the way, no plan ever survives contact with the enemy, and this plan was no different. But there were certain principles that we outlined that were followed during the conduct of the war, and that I think were actually very helpful in the first part of the campaign, the part of the war that we actually thought that we'd won. So as I mentioned before, what I said to the director was, well, look, remember, at the end of the day, this is a political problem. At the end of the day, what we need is some political authority in Afghanistan that will do permanently what we, the Americans, can't do for ourselves. That is to keep the country from again being a terrorist safe haven. And I said, look, if the Taliban is willing to be that force, then that's fine. And remember, the Taliban at this point controlled 90% of Afghanistan. They weren't recognized by very many governments as the legitimate government of Afghanistan, but they were the de facto government. And our hope at that relatively early day after 9/11 was that the Taliban could still be induced to change its policy, to turn bin Laden and his senior lieutenants over to American justice, and to keep his terrorist followers from remaining in their country. And so we said, well, first we need to reach out to the head of the Taliban, to Mullah Omar, and we need to ask him again, will you change policy? Will you join this new international coalition against terrorism? And if he refuses, then we have to hit him. We have to hit him hard as a lesson, as an object lesson to the others in his leadership. And if they refuse to change policy, then we have to hit them and the Taliban armed forces writ large, which means essentially that whatever political construct that we have in Afghanistan is going to get smashed, and we have to think about what we're going to replace it with. As we do that, I said, it's very, very important that we not appear to the mass of the Afghan people that we are simply invading and trying to occupy their country. That has not gone very well for large powers in the past. It went very badly for the Soviets in the 20th century. It went very badly for the British in the 19th century. And I was very concerned that we would repeat that unfortunate history. I said, we have to keep the U.S. military footprint very small. We have to make it very clear that we are not coming in on our own behalf to invade and to occupy their country, but in fact what we're doing instead is to come in support of Afghans who want to do for their own reasons what we would also like for them to do, and that is to chase out al-Qaeda and to make sure that their country is not again a safe haven. But as we do that, I said, we have to be very, very careful in the way that we choose our allies. Now remember, in 2001, Afghanistan was still in the hold of a civil war. Now, the Taliban controlled 90% of the country, but 10% of the country was still controlled by an organization that was referred to as the Northern Alliance. It was a collection of militias drawn from the ethnic and sectarian minorities in Afghanistan who had been fighting a civil war with the Taliban, a losing civil war with the Taliban for a number of years. And so obviously they were already opposed to the Taliban. If we were going to have to go to war with the Taliban, they would be a very natural ally. But I said we have to be very, very careful that we do not appear to the far more numerous Pashtuns from whom the Taliban movement is drawn, that we are simply coming in on the other side of a civil war. Because while many of the Pashtuns are sick and tired of the Taliban, while many of them are willing to stand up and oppose the Taliban, if they believe that we are simply coming in on the side of their enemies, then they will recoalesce around the Taliban, and the situation will be more difficult for us rather than better. So I said, absolutely, we need to reinforce the Northern Alliance, but at the same time, we need to find allies among the Pashtuns themselves. And we were aided in that respect by the fact that for the previous 18 months, I and my station had been reaching out to warlords, tribal leaders in the Pashtun south and east of the country, the ones who in principle at least, should have been most clearly aligned with the Taliban. But they had a long history, many of them, with the Taliban. Many of them had been in positions of power before the Taliban arose and had been pushed out of those positions of power by the Taliban and were looking for an opportunity to get back. So as I say, in those 18 months, we had reached out to many of these warlords, many of whom had been commanders back during the 1980s, during the anti-Soviet jihad, people who had received assistance from the Americans and the Pakistanis to drive out the Soviets back in the 1980s. And they were very glad to speak with us once again, in many cases. And so now after 9/11, we came to them again and we said, okay, look, we've been talking to you about rising up against the Taliban. Well, now is your opportunity. If you will rise up against the Taliban and push them out of power, you'll have the full weight of the U.S. military behind you, something that we certainly couldn't have promised them before. But almost to a person, they demurred. You don't prosper in Afghanistan by coming in on the wrong side of a fight. So they wanted to find out first if the Americans were serious, if we were actually going to attack the Taliban, and then they wanted to sit back for a little while longer and see which way this fight was going to go before they committed themselves. They didn't want to stick their heads above the gunwale and possibly have them cut off by the Taliban unless and until they were pretty sure that the sides that were being favored by the Americans were in fact going to win. And in fact, there were only two significant tribal leaders in all of southern Afghanistan who were actually willing to rise up, declare themselves against the Taliban, and to try to lead a tribal rebellion. The first was Hamid Karzai, who many of us know. He came out of this fairly well, thank you very much, two-time president of Afghanistan after the war. And the second was an individual by the name of Gulab Sherzai. He was the former governor of Kandahar. He had the dubious distinction of being the first tribal governor in Afghanistan to be pushed out of power by the Taliban when they began to organize themselves in 1994. Those were the only two. And so much of my book is taken up with the improbable story of how it was that these two Afghan tribal leaders were able to go back inside Afghanistan, organize their tribal followers, lead a rebellion against the Taliban, and survive long enough for a combination of CIA and special forces to come in to their aid and marshal the U.S. Air Force on their behalf to defeat the Taliban. Hamid Karzai had a very inauspicious start. He began by crossing the border with 3 followers. They were riding pillion on 2 motorcycles. They rode right into Kandahar under the noses of the Taliban. And in fact, in their first night in Kandahar, they could see the flashes of the first American airstrikes. They then traded their motorcycles for a taxi, and they drove up north into an area in southern Afghanistan called Uruzgan. And as they were crossing across the border from Kandahar province into Uruzgan province, they were stopped at a Taliban checkpost. And there was a young guard, just a boy really, couldn't even support a beard. And he examined their car and he said, "I want you to open this bag." Well, that was the bag that had the satellite telephone in it, which is the only way that they could communicate with us. They weren't about to let him inspect that bag. And so one of them went inside the checkpost to speak to the officer in charge. And Hamid and the 2 others who were waiting out in the car prepared their weapons. They said, "If we don't get out of here today, we're certainly not going to be captured. If we have to die here now, then we're willing to risk that." Well, fortunately, the commander of that checkpost decided he didn't care about them or their bag and just waved them onward to go back up to Uruzgan. When they got up to Uruzgan, Hamid went back to the tribal followers of his father, who had been the tribal leader before him, and they rallied to his side because many of them were sick of Taliban rule. But as they began to organize themselves, the Taliban back down in Kandahar realized that he was there, and they organized a force and sent it north to try to capture him. And the tribal leaders that he was with said, "Look, we're very sorry, but we can't protect you. We don't have enough armed men. So take some of our armed men and go up into the mountains so the Taliban won't capture you." And he did that. And for the next several weeks, which collectively must have erased a decade from my lifespan, he was being chased literally from mountaintop to mountaintop by the Taliban as we were trying to organize an airdrop of weapons to him and his followers. Unfortunately, we got an airdrop into him just before he was set upon by this Taliban force. And they fought a 2-day battle. At the end of which, he found himself on a high plateau up in the mountains of Uruzgan. And the tribal leaders who were with him said they'd managed to beat off the first Taliban attack. They weren't sure how long that they could hold out. And they said, look, if you can get the Americans to come in and pick you up, we'll go back to our villages and we'll recruit more fighters. And when you come back inside, we'll rejoin you. And so we did just that. And American Special Forces helicopters flew into Uruzgan. They picked up Hamid and 6 of his tribal elders, flew them out to an airbase in Pakistan. And there they were joined by a very small combined group of CIA operatives and Special Forces troops, only about 15 people altogether. And they flew back into Afghanistan to recruit another tribal force and with the help of the U.S. Air Force to begin the long march from central Afghanistan down to Kandahar. At roughly the same time, Gullah Sherzai crossed the border and quickly organized a considerably larger force. He had about 1,500 fighters with him. And again, with the help of the U.S. Air Force, a small team of CIA operatives and Special Forces soldiers marched in from the east. So the two were able to converge in early December 2001 on Kandahar and drive out the Taliban and al-Qaeda. At the same time that we were doing that in Afghanistan, there was a parallel war going on. Because as the al-Qaeda fighters, who were allied with bin Laden, realized that the situation was turning against them inside Afghanistan, they began to flee out into Pakistan in hopes of traveling through Pakistan onto Iran and onward back to their home countries. And as they did that, we in the CIA were working hand in glove with the infamous Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, the same organization that had refused to cooperate with us against terrorists for the previous several years. And now, because of the change in Pakistani policy, they began to work very closely with us in rounding up these members of al-Qaeda as they were fleeing into Pakistan. And in fact, they ended up comprising a very large proportion of the population of Guantanamo years later. There were other adventures along the way. There was a group of foreign missionaries, including 2 young American women who were taken captive by the Taliban just before 9/11 and who were held prisoner. And we tried to organize on a couple of occasions special forces raids so that we could liberate them. Well, we weren't able to get into them before the situation in Kabul began to unravel, and yet we still managed to get CIA people and U.S. Special Forces in to rescue them just as Kabul was falling to the Northern Alliance. There was also an organization called the UTN. It was a collection of Pakistani nuclear scientists. And we had credible information at that time that they had given nuclear materials and possibly, God forbid, a nuclear bomb to al-Qaeda. Well, I don't have to describe for you how that got Washington's attention. And so fortunately, we were able to get to the bottom of that situation and demonstrate to our satisfaction and Washington's that, in fact, they hadn't succeeded in providing a nuclear bomb to al-Qaeda. And in the days after the fall of the Taliban and al-Qaeda, we had a very close brush with all-out war between India and Pakistan. And I don't have to remind anybody here that both India and Pakistan are armed with nuclear weapons. So we could actually have had a nuclear war in our hands at the same time that we were going to fight with the Taliban and al-Qaeda. But as much as we were able to succeed in those 88 days, the 88 days that began with 9/11 and ended on the 7th of December 2001 when the Taliban and al-Qaeda were driven finally out of Kandahar, which was their southern capital. We really didn't fully understand, as I look back, exactly why we had been able to win that campaign. We didn't really fully understand the local politics that caused the Taliban to decide that they should surrender rather than fight on. And because we didn't fully understand the reasons why we'd won that war, we didn't really understand just how tenuous that victory was and how relatively easily it could be reversed. We take some time, and maybe some of you would like to ask some questions about it as to why it was that the Taliban was later able to come back. There were a lot of mistakes that were made, some by the Americans and our NATO allies, many more by the Afghans themselves. The people on the winning side in the war did what people often do on the winning side in wars. They didn't make sufficient provision for the Taliban and their followers, those who were allied with them, to demonstrate to them that there was a place for them in Afghan society going forward. And ultimately, they turned on the government of Hamid Karzai and his American followers. There was a lot that we didn't do in terms of a very rapid reconstruction of the country. Frankly, we were far too slow in coming to the aid of the Afghans as we promised we would at the outset of the war. Our national attention shifted very quickly from Afghanistan to Iraq, and as Douglas mentioned, in fact, I left Pakistan and Afghanistan in the summer of 2002 so that I could go back and participate in organizing CIA to support the war effort in Iraq. So our command attention shifted. And by early 2005, when I again returned to focus on Afghanistan and Pakistan, this time as the director of CIA's Counterterrorism Center, you could see that the situation was beginning to slip away from us. I made an extensive visit to both Pakistan and Afghanistan in the spring of 2005. And we didn't fully realize it then, but you could begin to see the opening signs that the Taliban was coming back. They were beginning to reassert power in significant parts of Afghanistan. And in my humble estimation, in the years after 2005, and beginning particularly in 2009 during the so-called surge, I think we made a very serious strategic error. Remember back in the beginning, we said that it was very important that the U.S. not be seen as an occupier in Afghanistan. We said it was very important that the Americans, whatever they did, were essentially operating behind the scenes in support of Afghans who were operating for their own reasons and out of a sense of Afghan nationalism. And what we did after 2005 instead was essentially to take over the war effort ourselves because of the manifest shortcomings of our Afghan allies, and it's true that they were not very effective in a lot of ways. There was rampant corruption inside of Afghanistan. There were many things that the Afghan government was doing, both by omission and commission, which was setting the stage for a resurgence of the Taliban. And so we decided, in effect, that Afghanistan was too busy to be left to the whims of Afghans. And the U.S. and NATO essentially took over the war effort. And during the surge, we went up. We had fully 100,000 American troops. We had another 40,000 from NATO. We were spending $100 billion a year. We completely overwhelmed this small, primitive, agrarian country with a tiny GDP, nascent national institutions. And while, yes, we did gain a lot, we did manage to retrieve significant areas from Taliban control, we were making gains that Afghans themselves were simply not able to sustain, which led the administration to change course and to essentially evacuate from Afghanistan. Now we're left with a very, very small residual force. And the concern that I have now is that having made the mistake of trying to do too much in 2009, 2010, 2011, I think that we're compounding that error now by trying to do too little. And the concern that I have is that with such a small American and international force, and with that force itself scheduled to leave by the end of 2016, that when those last foreign troops leave, at the same time, foreign financial assistance to the Afghan government is going to drive up as well. That without American and international troops there, it's going to be very difficult to convince the U.S. Congress and the parliaments of other European countries to maintain a level of financial assistance that will be necessary in order to sustain the Afghan government. And there's a lesson in this. When the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, a lot of people thought that the government that they were backing at the time would collapse. Well, it didn't. In fact, it did quite well for an additional 2 years. The reason that they were reversed and they were overthrown eventually by the Mujahideen was not because the Russian troops were not there any longer. It was because the Russian money stopped. And I'm afraid that we may again repeat that history in Afghanistan. And if that were to happen, and if the government in Kabul were to fall, and the Taliban were to reassert itself over much, if not all, of the country, eventually, and maybe in the relatively near future, as the situation with foreign jihadists begins to shift around the globe. Right now, the main focus of their attention is Iraq and Afghanistan, the rise of what's referred to as the Islamic State or ISIS. Eventually, as they're rolled back, as I believe eventually they will be looking for new safe havens elsewhere in the world. And my concern is that if the Taliban is in full control of substantial parts of Afghanistan, once again, they will go there. And the U.S. won't be able to ignore their presence in the future as we haven't in the past, and that we may be called upon to fight in Afghanistan yet another time. This book was a long time in coming. I knew that I was going to write this book. I knew I wanted to write this book as early as the end of 2001, at the end of those 88 days, when the Taliban was driven out of Kandahar. And I knew what I was going to call it, 88 Days to Kandahar. And when I left government in middle of 2006, I toyed with the idea of writing it then, but I got busy with other things and didn't actually get around writing it until last year. Well, I'm actually glad that I waited, because if I'd written this book in 2006, 2007, essentially this would have been an adventure story, the story of the 88 days and how we managed to drive Al-Qaeda and the Taliban out of Afghanistan and how it was that we'd won the war. Well, now we know the rest of the story. And we know that while perhaps we won that first American-Afghan war, we certainly didn't win the second American-Afghan war after 2005. And there are premonitions now that we may be yet called upon to fight a third American-Afghan war, if, as I fear, the government in Kabul is not sufficiently supported and Afghanistan again becomes a safe haven for international terrorists. So thank you very much for your attention. And I would invite you to ask questions. Now, for those of you who would like to ask questions, there are microphones on either side of the auditorium here. So I would invite you just to line up behind the microphone. And please just identify yourself by name. And I'm very happy to get your comments, but please keep comments short, and let's try to make questions.
My name is Dina Mudiano Fox. I was just wondering, in view of your experience in the past, what should the American government be doing now?
What should the American government be doing in Afghanistan?
Right now, in Afghanistan, in that part of the world, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned before, I feel that we tried to do too much during the surge in Afghanistan, that we were fighting on our own account in a way that alienated many Afghans and put us in a position where Afghans would not be able to sustain the gains that we were making. That it would have been far wiser, although it would have required a great deal of patience and would have involved running the risk of, frankly, of abject failure, that we could not win for Afghans what Afghans could not win for themselves. And now, as I mentioned before, I'm afraid that we're compounding that error by doing too little. So what ought we to be doing, I think? Well, I'm not quite sure what the precise number of troops ought to be. I think it needs to be more than the 9,800 that we have there right now. I think it probably needs to be less than 20,000, but that what's critical is not so much the number of troops we have, but what they're doing. And right now, the task for American troops in Afghanistan is to provide support and training for the Afghan National Army, which frankly I think is unsustainably large. So I think that going forward, we need to, yes, be training and equipping a manageably small Afghan army, but no centralized Afghan army has ever been able to control the country. It's a country in which power is very much diffused around the countryside. And so I think that we need to also be working with U.S. Special Forces in support of those Afghans who in their own areas are willing to rise up against the Taliban. Now, one of the immediate objections to that is, well, doesn't that mean that you're reinforcing warlords? And the short answer to that is yes. And yes, there are downsides to supporting warlords, because often warlords end up preying on the local people rather than working on behalf of the local people. Well, I think that there are a number of things that we can do when you understand the culture, when you understand the tribal structure in the areas where you're operating, to make warlords the best warlords that they can be. It takes a lot of wisdom to do that. But frankly, I think that's what we need to be doing. So I think we need to have a sufficient number of troops that, yes, we can work with the Afghan National Army, but also work with local warlords, local militias who are willing and who have the tribal standing to rise up against the Taliban. Many of them actually do want to do that, and make sure that a potential terrorist safe haven in the future, rather than being an uncontested safe haven, will at least be a contested safe haven, that we'll be in a position where we can drive terrorists out of areas where we know that they're planning terrorist operations well outside of Afghanistan. Eventually, we hope the Taliban is going to realize that, you know what, they can't win this war. And once they realize that, then I think we'll see serious negotiations to come to some sort of a negotiated solution. Yes, sir.
Thank you for returning. I know the snow prevented your giving this lecture several months ago. I believe you were listed to do that, so I appreciate it. I'd like to talk specifically about the money you talked about. A lot of money has gone in Afghanistan. In the Soviet time, you mentioned that the Soviet money dried up and things changed. Right. And I'm curious, as far as the what if, you were in a situation where you were at crossroads, Northern Alliance versus Taliban. Right. Let's say that more pressure or support was put into the Taliban direction in regards to control and developing that type of regime. Was that possible from your perspective? It seemed like after 9/11 there were mystery dialogues occurring, and do this by this point, and we're coming in, and we eventually came in. And it seems like what we have now is, as you said, a third potential a theater or operation because of a conflict that exists. The Taliban is there. They go into caves, they disappear, and they come back out. So I'm curious about the support in trying to resolve the Taliban issue from that perspective.
Okay. So if I understand your question correctly, the first part is, well, what if we had reinforced our efforts to try to make a deal with the Taliban at the outset?
Versus the Karzai direction, right?
Versus the Karzai direction. Well, yeah, and I didn't mention it in this talk, but I describe it at some length in the book. I had two very lengthy meetings back before the start of hostilities. 9/11 occurred, obviously, on 11th of September. The U.S. bombing of the Taliban began and Al-Qaeda began on the 7th of October, 2001. Well, during that interim, I had two lengthy meetings with Mullah Osmani, who was the number 2 figure in the Taliban at that time. And I won't describe them at great length, but in the first one, he was there. He made it very clear that he was there as a representative of Mullah Omar, and he had an official note taker with him. And at first, I was tremendously encouraged because he said, in fact, we knew this beforehand. I thought that in coming to this meeting with me, that Mullah Osmani might have a personal agenda as well, because we knew from our intelligence that, in fact, he didn't like bin Laden, and he didn't like Al-Qaeda. He frankly didn't want them in the country. And at the outset of our conversation, he said, well, look, he said, you know, we don't like bin Laden, and we don't like his followers. They're a problem for you. They're a problem for us. We need to cooperate together to find a way to solve this problem. I thought, well, now we're talking. Okay. We got something to work with here. So we went through a whole range of different options, ways that they could potentially, that Taliban could potentially cooperate with us. And I said, look, if it's too sensitive politically for you and you want to do something to get bin Laden out of here and turn him over to us without your fingerprints on it, we can find a way to do that. So we discussed various ways that we might be able to do that. And in the end, he said, no, none of this is going to work. So I said, well, okay. And he said, but I'll take all of your ideas and I'll go back to Mullah Omar and he will decide. So that's what he did. And then we had a second meeting. And by this time, Mullah Omar had come out publicly and he said, no, we're not going to turn over bin Laden. And you could see at that time that attitudes were hardening in Washington. But they were pretty much decided that, you know, we're going to war in Afghanistan. Nothing's going to stop it. And so in that second meeting with Mullah Osmani, I said, look, it's clear that your boss, Mullah Omar, is not going to do this. And therefore, if you want to save your country, if you want to save your movement, you have to gently push him aside, hold him incommunicado, and you need to seize power. And we went through the laundry list of things that I felt he needed to do. And he came up with lots of reasons why he didn't think that he should do this. And finally, we came down to it. And you could tell he was in despair because he said, oh, my God, the Americans are coming. What are we going to do about this? And once again, I said, look, you need to push Mullah Omar aside. And we went through in a lot of detail about what he could do in order to seize power and to announce that al-Qaeda was no longer welcome. And he said, okay, I'll do it. And then he went back to Kandahar and clearly had a change of heart. And he and I were continuing to speak by satellite phone right up until, and in fact, after the U.S. bombing started. Our conversations after the bombing started were considerably less polite than they were before the bombing started. But in any case, in fact, there was an excerpt from my book which appeared in the Atlantic magazine where essentially they're saying, well, if we'd had more time, is it possible that we could have convinced the Taliban to change power, and then maybe history would have been different. The U.S. wouldn't have had to launch this campaign. Things might have been very, very different in Afghanistan. And I have to tell you in all honesty that as much faith as I have in my persuasive powers, I gave it my best shot with Mullah Osmani. And I just don't think he was going to do it. And he agreed at first that he would, but when it came right down to it, he just wasn't going to do it. And it wasn't until later that I really began to understand the inner workings of the Taliban sufficiently that I began to fully understand what a hold Mullah Omar had over these people. And there was no way, he really had them divided. They didn't trust one another. The only person that they trusted for the most part was him. So he was like the hub of the wheel. And all of his key people had personal relationships with him. And that's how he was able to manipulate the people around him and to maintain power. And there was no way that they were going to come together and overthrow Mullah Omar and change policy. I didn't realize that in September. I realized it later on. So it's a very long answer to your very short and straightforward question. If given more time, could we have somehow convinced the Taliban to change policy? And I think that the answer is simply no. We gave it our best try. We certainly weren't able to do that. And so, the second part of your question,
I guess related to that is, you said it's going to kind of come full circle potentially is your prediction. And so what you started, and I guess it's difficult now because you can't be, you could be negotiating with the Taliban today, but you have this other government that's in place as well. And I guess it all relates to the money, that a lot of money has gone into Afghanistan. There's a lot of as I understand, infrastructure that's been developed that's not being utilized that could be, and some other things related to that. Now, you've obviously moved on, and the people that are in that there now have to work out that. But do you think there's an opportunity there to resolve that now?
Yeah, back around 2012, 13, there were the start of some conversations between the Americans and the Taliban. And at the time, I was very skeptical that anything would come of those discussions because it seemed pretty clear that the Taliban felt that they were in the ascendancy, that the only thing that was keeping them from, again, assuming power in Afghanistan was the American military presence. And so they really didn't want to talk to the Afghan government. They refused to talk to Hamid Karzai, who was still president of Afghanistan at the time. And I felt that they were willing to talk to the Americans about the conditions under which they would withdraw. But that's all they were really willing to talk about. Now that the Americans have substantially withdrawn, and you have what is, at least in the Taliban eyes, a far more independent Afghan government, they've again begun to have conversations with that government. And in fact, just in the last few days, there were Taliban representatives who the Taliban were very careful to say we're not engaged in negotiations. They're only appearing as individuals, speaking on their own behalf, not on behalf of the Taliban, but having informal discussions with representatives of the Afghan government. And so these were sort of exploratory discussions, and there are some hopeful things that have come out of those discussions from what we understand. It appears that these Taliban representatives are saying that, among other things, they're willing to have a different policy with regard to women's education, women's rights. But I don't think at the end of the day that they are going to be serious about reaching some sort of a political accommodation with the government in Kabul unless and until they feel that military success is beyond their grasp. So I think we've got some way to go before we reach that point. And another thing is that I'm not really sure that the Taliban is capable of reaching a negotiated solution. I don't think that they're capable of operating as a political party among political parties and forming some sort of a coalition government. I just don't think it's in their DNA. Now, maybe I'm wrong. People evolve, organizations evolve. There may be a lot that I don't understand about the Taliban of today versus the Taliban that I was dealing with a number of years ago. But I think that the Taliban is best understood as a social movement. And I had some very interesting discussions a couple of years ago with one of the founders of the Taliban, an individual by the name of Mullah Zaif, who was actually the Taliban ambassador to Pakistan before 9/11, and who ended up being arrested by the Pakistanis and spent 5 years in Guantanamo. Now he's out and he's living freely. And as I say, I've had a couple of long conversations with him. And interestingly, he says that he's still considered a member of the Taliban. He's withdrawn himself from the fight, but is still very much respected by the Taliban. And he says, look, I think, and what I tell my colleagues is that we should get out of politics. That we, as a movement, really shouldn't be trying to govern. Instead, we should remain what we were before, and that is a social movement that forces those in power to follow the path of Islam. And I reckon that in those parts of Afghanistan where they naturally hold sway, that may be the role that they will have going forward, that people affiliated with them may hold government positions in their respective areas. But the Taliban as a party, I don't think is going to play a political role on the national stage. I may just be wrong, but that's what I think.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. This is really a follow-up to your response to the first question, what we should be doing now. Given that these are tribal societies, that their loyalties are tribal, that they don't seem to have an appetite for or even any concept of some kind of centralized governing body, how do you train an army, an effective army, given that, if their loyalties are to their tribe, and there isn't an overarching loyalty? I mean, Iraq is kind of an example. We trained their army. When ISIS appears, they cut and run because they don't have any sense of loyalty to an overarching thing. So how do you take that into account when you talk about going in there and training their army to be effective?
Yeah, I mean, you put your finger on a real difficulty. There's no question about it. And I would say that, yes, Afghanistan is a tribal society, that people's hierarchy of loyalties sort of runs from family to clan to tribe, and then region, and then maybe ultimately to the nation as a whole. But Afghans do have a sense of national identity. For all that they are tribal, they do have a sense of national identity. And so I don't think you'd ever see a formal partitioning of Afghanistan, despite the huge differences between the Tajik areas and the Uzbek areas and the Pashtun areas. They do have this sense of national identity. But I strongly suspect that the Afghan army now, which unsurprisingly is heavily weighted toward the old Northern Alliance, that a disproportionate number of the troops in the army are Tajiks and Uzbeks, as opposed to Pashtuns, although there are Pashtuns in the army. That part of the reason that they are fighting loyally is because fighting loyally on behalf of a government is because the government is dominated by people from their ethnicity and their sect. So I don't say it's not impossible to have a national army. Afghanistan has had a national army in the past, but when push comes to shove, and when it's clear that the army is fighting on behalf of a government which isn't representative of significant parts of the country, that there's always that tendency that the army will splinter. The case in Iraq, I was involved in Iraq for quite a number of years, and I think there are a lot of mistakes, frankly, that we made right from the beginning in the way that we reconstructed the Iraqi National Army. I don't think that we gave them a sufficient sense of themselves as an Iraqi army. I think they sprang from battalions that we were training that were essentially reliant upon the Americans to fight against the insurgents. So I think there's a somewhat different situation in Iraq than in Afghanistan. But you're right, the sense of national identity is a fragile thing and something that you have to watch very, very closely. So I don't say it's impossible to have an Afghan national army, but it's one that does have to consider itself to be comprised of elements which are representative of the country as a whole. And if at some point elements within the army feel that their tribe, their sect is no longer being adequately accommodated in the national political setup, then they will withdraw. There's no question about it. And they certainly won't fight effectively. Yes, sir.
Thank you. What do we know about the existence or the whereabouts of Mullah Omar? Is he still alive? I mean, are we not investing the resources to find him that we invested to find Osama bin Laden?
Yeah, there's a lot of, as was the case with bin Laden, there's a lot of speculation about Mullah Omar. And in fact, there are some people who suggest that he must be dead. Well, if he were dead, people in the Taliban would know it, and it wouldn't remain a secret for very long. And I think if he were dead, we would know that. And it's amazing that he has been able to hide as successfully as he has for such a long period of time. But on the other hand, I would point out two things. One is that we, the Americans, have not been as focused on chasing down senior members of the Taliban who are not actively engaged in the insurgency inside Afghanistan. So much of the intelligence-led U.S. military operations in Afghanistan have been focused on local commanders because they're the ones who are killing our troops, rather than trying to hunt down Mullah Omar hiding, as we suspect he must be, somewhere in Pakistan. Excuse me. By the same token, the Pakistanis have not been particularly eager to chase down Mullah Omar. And if they knew where he was, I don't think that they would tell us where he was. Because I could see, even in my time in Pakistan, as early as say the spring of 2002, already you could see that the Pakistanis were hedging their bets. They were working very carefully and very effectively with us to capture members of Al-Qaeda. But somehow when we would give them leads, and in all honesty, I must say that we, the Americans and CIA, were focused like a laser beam on Al-Qaeda. We thought at that early stage that the Taliban was essentially a spent force. And so we weren't really focusing our intelligence capabilities very heavily in trying to track down senior members of the Taliban. And I also knew when I was still the chief of station, that it was very unlikely, even if we gave the Pakistanis very good information, that they were going to manage to capture these senior members of the Taliban, because they were already thinking ahead. They were thinking, look, we've seen this play before. We've seen what the Americans did when the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan. They no longer saw a national interest in remaining there. The Americans withdrew, and they were anticipating that we would withdraw from Afghanistan again in the future. They also realized that the new government in Kabul, although it was under Hamid Karzai, who is himself a Pashtun, was heavily dominated by the Northern Alliance. And the Northern Alliance traditionally has had very bad relations with the Pakistanis and close relations with their arch enemies, the Indians. So the Pakistanis, although in pursuit of their own national interests to make sure that there was a friendly government in Kabul, which they didn't consider to have when Hamid Karzai formed a government there after the defeat of the Taliban. So, as I say, the Pakistanis ever since have been hedging their bets, and we're certainly not about to turn Mullah Omar or any of his other senior lieutenants over to us. Whether in that context we could have tracked him down on our own, as we managed to track down bin Laden, perhaps. But again, it's a difficult undertaking if the individuals who are being pursued have a very low profile, are hiding among an indigenous population that is committed to protecting them. It's going to be very, very difficult. And obviously the U.S. can't send special forces crawling around inside Pakistan without the Pakistanis knowing about it pretty quickly. So I have an idea that we're going to see Mullah Omar alive and well and back inside Afghanistan before he's ever captured by us or anybody else. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you, sir. The narrative has brought out your book into a sharp relief, and I appreciate that. 3 questions. Currency. How well is the dollar holding up across the borders? How do people move money? Weapons, guns, people, opium. Is the dollar holding steady between all the borders? And I'd like to know your favorite aviation vehicle for popping around across all these areas, because you did a lot of that. I know you made me like Chinooks. And is the C-17 a really worthy desert, unimproved runway a vehicle for transporting all these things, since we're going in and out all the time? Is that really a worthy aviation tool?
Gosh, it's quite a series of questions, and I'm not sure that I'm fully qualified to answer all of them. I admit I haven't really been following the exchange rate for the U.S. dollar in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of international trade in the Afghani, but all that said, absolutely. Right. Well, listen. Yeah, it's one of the mysteries, really. If you look at insurgent forces, tribal forces, terrorist forces, and you wonder how it is that they're able to sustain themselves, since they're often in very poor parts of the world, and you wonder where they get the money, where do they get the guns, and I think that the answer is that, you know, in that part of the world, when fighters really aren't paid very much at all, and the population writ large is awash in weapons, that indigenous insurgent forces are able to cobble things together and to fight relatively easily, and they don't require huge sources of outside funding. Now, I think that the Taliban has had some sources of funding, you know, wealthy people who are sympathetic to their cause, particularly in the Persian Gulf. But you know, we hear a lot about, you know, the U.S. Treasury Department, and God bless them. I have very good friends, you know, who've led that effort within the Department of the Treasury, and who talk about, you know, the importance of cutting off the sources of funding, you know, whether it's to Al Qaeda or to the Islamic State or to the Taliban. That's very difficult to do. It's not like cracking down on the mafia. It's not like you have, you know, a hidden banking system, you know, that where if you can sort of, you know, shut off those flows of funds, that you can starve them of resources. Terrorism and insurgency is largely a cash and carry business, and to the extent that there are outside sources of funding, that generally moves in cash and via couriers. There are large parts of the world where, for all that you know, currency is almost becoming an afterthought to us, you know, we do almost everything with credit cards. In large parts of the world, they still make major purchases with cash, and that's still very much the case in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and a number of the countries in the Gulf and elsewhere in the Middle East. One of the things we often hear as well is that, well, it must be the opium trade in Afghanistan that the Taliban has seized control of, and this is how they're able to fund themselves. Well, the Taliban does not now, nor has it ever really controlled the opium trade. There are traditional opium traders who provide seeds, literally, and cash to the farmers at the beginning of the growing season, and then collect back what's owed to them in the form of opium after the poppy harvest has come in. And in those areas that the Taliban is able to control, they're able to tax the opium trade. And typically it's 10%. So yes, they're able to tax it in the same way that other warlords and the Afghan government itself is able to tax it. But again, it doesn't mean that they have to control that industry in order to get you know, financial benefit from it. So that comes some way, at least, in answering your question. With regard to the operation of C-17s on unimproved runways, C-17 is a big aircraft. I've seen a lot of them. I'm not sure they're able to operate off of completely unimproved runways, but it's a very, very good, very effective aircraft. It can operate on small landing strips. But in places like Afghanistan, it's the prop-driven C-130 that's probably the transport aircraft of choice, because they can operate on relatively unimproved airstrips, and they can take off and land you know, very, very quickly, and those are really, really effective. Is that good?
Favorite aircraft?
For me getting around. You know what? You know, you know what? You know what's really good is the Russian helicopters. The Russian helicopters, the Mi-17, are very, very good aircraft, and because they can operate at high altitudes. And so still now in Afghanistan, for the Pakistanis and to some extent for the Afghans as well, it's the MIs, the Russian helicopters that are probably the most effective in those mountain areas. And frankly, when I was flying in and out of Afghanistan, that's what I was flying on.
You found spare parts there? That,
They're around.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.